So the focus of the seminar is podcast advertising. What is it and where to start? So it's a very interesting topic, and there's a lot we're going to go into today. But just to give an introduction of what is podcast advertising, a lot of the people think podcast advertising is just setting up a podcast channel themselves. Now that is one form to promote your brand and create content, but I would not class that as podcast advertising. Podcast advertising is on the rise because even though podcast advertising has been around for 20 years, believe it or not, only in the last few years as a medium, as a digital channel medium, has it really grown in impact and growth and results in terms of what can be achieved by advertising through it. And we'll get into different ways of how you can advertise and how to begin and where to start. But what is it? It is essentially programmatic audio. So you might think of programmatic audio as a mixture between radio advertising and programmatic display. It is a relatively new format. It comes in many different platforms, such as features in podcast events like Spotify. It'll appear in streaming apps or other kind of radio platforms. As it's programmatic, it's bought on a marketplace, as you would do with display advertising, where you can, decide what kind of audiences you want to go for, depending on what they're listening to, the type of content they're listening to, and you can target that based on different platforms. Obviously, the example we've shown here is obviously, Spotify, where you can actually place, little snippets and audio ads within a particular podcast that is driving. So that's, as a short, quick definition, what podcast advertising is. Some stats in terms of why it's important right now. So what we know is, and this is as of January 2021, is that there's currently over 1.7 million shows. There's a lot of data out there is actually, outdated, but this is the latest results we could get, which goes up to January 2021. We know there are almost over 43 million episodes of podcast activity. To kind of highlight the growth, Apple confirmed in 2018 that there were, 550,000 podcasts, at any one time. So from that to 1.7 million shows the growth of where we are, and that there's over 43 million episodes. There's a lot of content globally for your audiences to consume. And what do we know about them? That podcast listeners are loyal, affluent, and educated. We know that, 45% of listen to most of the episode, 35%, so over a third of people listening to a podcast are listening to the entire episode of it. Only a few percentage listen to, less than half, but only the beginning. But when you add the stats around, the entire episode of most people, that's around about 80% of those listeners to podcasts that listen to most of the episode or the entire episode. So they're very, very engaged, so that's about an average 7 shows per week that they're listening to as well. So a lot of users and audiences out there, which is why the IAD is forecasting over £1 billion in ad spend this year to be spent on podcast advertising. There's a reason for it. And lockdown and people being at home and trying to, break out to other types of media platforms other than social media has had a significant impact on podcasts. It's why we as an agency launched Bubble Podcast back in September, not to advertise with, but to kind of understand, the users who listen and understand where those demographics come from, to understand the other side of podcasting. So just a little bit of terminology that will help you. Again, don't think you have to write all this down. We will be sharing the presentation with you at the end. There's a lot of different types of acronyms and terminology that I use within podcast advertising, especially if you're new to the market and you're thinking, how do I buy this and what does it all mean? So pre-roll, so that gets mentioned at the beginning of a YouTube. So think YouTube pre-roll in terms of what goes on. So if you've ever been on a YouTube, video, you get the pre-roll ad, and that's what happens as a pre-roll ad in terms of podcasts. It'll be an advert that appears or is shown or displayed before the podcast episode itself actually rolls. Mid-roll is that it plays midpoint somewhere into the podcast, or you've got outro where a few words of the podcast advertiser can slip in a final call to action for you. There's things you can do around it, such as like an offer code. So that's like giving a particular coupon code to help you track conversions, and we'll get into this in terms of how, ROI and tracking your ROI and analytics on podcast advertising is important and how you can do that. Native ads. So this, matches the different platforms and an extension of it. So If you're on Spotify, a particular Square ad could appear on your mobile phone as your ad is being played, and you could potentially click through to that. Podcatcher is basically software used to play a podcast. So that's a terminology that we'll be using throughout the presentation. Direct response. So again, that's like a form of, marketing advertising that can be used to measure or track. So for podcasts, this will predominantly be URLs or offer codes. CPM, so that's cost per milli, or milli is cost per thousand. So that's how you normally buy your podcast. You buy at cost per thousand, podcast plays, essentially. So it's be at a rate of, let's say 20, 30 pound CPM, and we'll get that onto the next slide. And then CPA, which is your cost per acquisition, or cost to acquire a new customer in terms of advertisement. So there's just some terminology that'll help you, which some I'll be using throughout the presentation, but some that you need to be aware of if you're going to be entering the podcast advertising stream. So examples of costs, I get asked this quite a lot. It's like, I want to do podcast advertising, but how much does it cost to get involved in podcast advertising? So here are some average rates based, and again, they're based on dollars because that's the data that comes through to us based on different lengths of time. So, this is based on advertised cast that's shared, podcast advertising rates. If you want to pay as a 10-second ad within a podcast, you're looking at around about, $15 or around about £12 per 1,000 podcast plays. For 30 seconds, that increases to around about $18, around about £16. For a full 60-second, ad, you're looking at more around $25 or £22 in terms of cost per 1,000 plays. So when you pay £22, that will give you 1,000, reach up to 1,000 listeners at a go. So that looks quite good, but you've got to realize it's sometimes about volume and getting out there. But the more you go for, in terms of the more broad your audience is, the quicker your budget can pile up. If you're on a small budget, which I understand most people within this seminar are, it's good to probably go for the, short ad spots because, it costs less per 1,000. Yes, you get less pace, but you just got to consider stuff like YouTube ads and social ads, especially the video content around them. They're no longer than 5 to 10 seconds. So if you can do a video ad in 5 to 10 seconds, I'm pretty sure you can do a podcast ad within 10 seconds, max 30 seconds to help you get more reach for and best book for your money. So that kind of explains what podcast advertising is, a bit of terminology, some stats behind it, and example costs to get into it. But, where do you start? What next? So we've come up with a 4-point solution to help you to get in front of and how to start a podcast advertising campaign. So, find your audience fit, as I always say. So the good news is 75% of podcast listeners not only pay attention to podcast ads, they also follow specific call to actions after hearing them. So just consider that stat that we showed at the start, that 80%, listen to most or all of the podcasts. Just consider 75% of them are considering taking some form of call to action. Now that call to action could be clicking through to your website or searching your brand name or trying to redeem an offer because they've heard it within the podcast element. The key element here for you is connecting with the audience. Don't try to force your ads into popular podcasts because you think that's going to work. It's not based on the size a particular podcast channel has. It's about understanding who your audience is. And we've talked about this in a number of previous bite-sized events where we talked about planning and understanding your audience. If you really struggle, I always say go to your Google Analytics and look at your demographic breakdown in terms of who your audience are, who visits your website, because you will be buying programmatically, which means you'll be able to target by specific demographics, by geolocation if you want to, by age, by gender. You can then overlay that with what we call affinity audiences, such as people we know that are interested in sports or fitness or food and drink or going out and eating, etc., depending on who your audience are. It's good to kind of understand who your audience is and not just say, right, I just want to go for a broad reach, because that will essentially be wasting budget and you'll have thousands of listeners basically taking no impact on no recognition of your ad or your brand at that point. On the other hand, it's good to investigate the audience fit before you do spend a dime. Be careful not to make assumptions about your audience's biased behavior. So what we're trying to mean by that is don't just assume that because your audience is, for example, fitness consumers, that they're only listening to fitness podcasts. that is not the case. They will be listening to Joe Rogan. They may be entrepreneurs trying to listen to more, well-being and mental and, entrepreneurship kind of podcasts and following particular, celebrities or influencers around their podcast insights that they find interesting, not just, how to recover from a workout. So don't just, assume what your audience does. That's why the audience fit is crucial for podcast advertising success. If you understand your audience, you know how better to place that with particular podcasts or at a programmatic level when you're trying to target that specific audience at a wider level. The next thing is refine your approach. Now, there's two ways you can do podcast advertising in the industry, and that we call it baked in or dynamically inserted. So baked in is basically me going up to let's say Joe Rogan or Kate Leeson out there, or someone coming up to our podcast saying, we like your podcast, we want to kind of sponsor it, we want to do something. And basically that person then gets involved. So that's where the ad is part of the podcast content. You might see this quite popular with, YouTube vloggers. Or YouTube influencers where they're kind of pushing a particular sponsor or pushing a particular product, saying this episode is brought to you by XYZ as a brand. So you will see a lot of that within podcasts. So you might not hear particular ads, but you might hear particular companies sponsoring that particular type of content by going to them directly. The other is dynamically inserted, and that's what we at Bubble Digital do here more often than not, and actually are trialing. So dynamically inserted is what we just talked about. That is going through a DSP, so a demand side platform, where we can break down our audience demographics, and we want to target a young demographic of 18 to 24-year-olds. We know they're gym goers, we know they're an X amount, we know they live in these particular areas, and we know that predominantly they're interested in the following social elements. And then that platform then dynamically inserts that podcast ad across different variations of considers 43 million episodes. Across those different episodes, it'll start placing that ad, dynamically insert it based on the targeting and trying to target your ideal audience. And we always say that's a better way of doing it. We always see the bigger brands tend to go for more baked in kind of approach, where they want to sign themselves with a particular influencer because they're sustainable and they're trying to push, let's say, a sustainability model, for example. But dynamically inserted is quite effective. How do you know which one you should use? Well, there's a fairly even split dynamically. And again, it's hard to get latest data on this because it is still a new platform. But we know that spend grew by 51% by dynamically inserted ads over the course of the year, according to, the 2017 podcasting revenue study. And for baked in ads, live host read ads continue to be preferred type of delivery. So it is a bit of an even split. We know that especially over the last 2 years, there has been a switch to more dynamically insertion because there's more platforms available now. Platforms like Spotify allow you to do, specific targeted ads to within podcasts. But there are other bigger platforms that bring stuff like Apple Podcasting, Spotify Podcasting, Google, etc., and can allow you to target multiple platforms from just one campaign. But if you're not sure, I always say A/B test the two. Maybe go for dynamic inserted as one strategy, and then approach a few podcasters with a good following after you've listened to them and done your research, and build a relationship with them and see how you can feature and compare the two to see what did better in terms of results and ROI. Have a budget in mind. I talked about what it generally does cost to get into podcast advertising, but remember, it is a powerful and persuasive tool, but it isn't free. Most podcasters use either a CPA or CPM formula, and we already talked about cost per acquisition and cost per milli, although some may quote a basically flat fee for you to work with it, but cost per thousand, the most common. So, if you go direct, so go in the baked in approach and you go to a podcast influencer directly, if he's achieving, 50,000 podcast listeners for every episode he does, he's going to charge you, per thousand of that 50. So you're going to get charged 50 times the CPM rate here. So even if it's, let's say, 10,000 listeners, you'd be looking at $250 is the example we've put in the bottom right. So if they're getting, 50,000 listeners on average, they're probably going to charge you 5 times that amount. So that quickly adds up to, around about $1,250 just to appear directly with them. But before you, approach that podcaster for a spot, you need a clear picture of the objectives. In other words, plan what you want to do with your campaign, and make sure that, if you have a budget in mind, have a particular offer or a particular landing page set up, or some kind of URL landing page for them to visit, and try and tailor your content with them. Work with the podcaster because they know who their audience are and they'll share those statistics with you. But it's more importantly, it's working with them closely to understand, what's the best fit for their audience, understanding previous, baked in examples they've done with other clients that they've worked with, and understanding the success rates of that. And they'd be more than happy to share that with you. If you're doing it by CPM model through, dynamically inserted, then you need to now have to then calculate what your realistic budget is. So let's say if it's just £500, then you need to then be looking at the around about £12 CPM model, which will get you the most value. But then that's where it's important to understand who your audience is. Calculate how much it will take to reach your objectives and secure, internal improvement up front before you spend it, if you have to go through that process. So, we just have to say that. We don't just say go now and spend on podcast advertising. Make sure you plan, have a realistic budget in place now that you have an idea of what it costs to get into particular platforms, and understand your objectives of what you want to achieve, and then pick the right method, baked in or dynamically inserted, or a mixture of the two. And then the last step, report and analyze your ROI. So you're going to need to get data to prove return on your advertising spend. That's why digital marketing works so well. That's why, everyone wants to use digital agencies or invest into podcast advertising, because it is measurable. And there are a few ways you can do this. The easiest way is to use that vanity URL. So if you're doing dynamic inserted or you're going direct with the podcasters, then you need to be given a particular URL and create a custom URL for them. So maybe it's related to that podcast. So you could put the podcast name at the end. So if it was us, it would be bubbledigital.com/Joe Rogan, if we did it with Joe Rogan, as an example URL. But make sure it's trackable. So anyone who's gone onto the Joe Rogan URL, they've kind of more often than not listened to the Joe Rogan podcast and thus liked what they've heard from a baked in point of view, and then gone onto the website. The other way you can do that is if you're doing, let's say, audio ads, so it's 10, 30 or 60 seconds, you could push a promo code. And then you could do like a particular promo code, such as, a pod 20 for 20% off, but you'll call it pod because that it was the podcast channel that delivered that code that's available right now to deliver. So then you can have a look at your internal transactions. If you're an e-commerce site or someone's gone on to get a reduction of your services or a discount on, I don't know, if you're B2B, to get a discount on the setup fees of implementing your services. Let's say if you're an IT company, have a particular code in place so you can track and impact whether that code or that introduction came from the work you've done from podcast advertising. I always say what isn't measured can't be improved. So, make sure you're leveraging at least one of those measurement tools overall within your actual campaign to measure ROI. And then finally, I just want to give you an idea of, podcast advertising is key, but this is the kind of podcast I listen to. Obviously, I listen to mine because I like to hear back what I said and whether I didn't make a fool of myself before I do it. So, but I'm listening to stuff like Health, Wealth and Happiness, the Joe Rogan Experience, but I really love Katie Leeson's I Shouldn't Share This, but because it really speaks to me at a director level in terms of her sharing her experiences and me being able to resonate with it. So as someone who's into, Marvel and, a lot of like sci-fi and, Liverpool Football Club, I'm not listening to much sport elements or anything like that. I'm listening to something unique. And that's why we said trying to understand the audience fit, because not necessarily the audience you want to target are listening to the types of content you think or you assume they're listening to, which is why I always say dynamically inserted podcast ads might work better for you if you already know who your audience are and letting the platform pick who they think is the best fit for your podcast, as opposed to going direct. And that seems to be the norm. So that's a quick roundup of our podcast advertising webinar. I'm now going to stop sharing for a second and open it up to questions from everyone in the audience to ask any particular questions they had on that. Podcast isn't like social or video where we can go into a lot of technical. There are just two ways you can do it, and you can either buy by going direct to the podcaster, or you can do it dynamically inserted. But hopefully that's giving you an insight in terms of what it is, some of the acronyms, the potential cost entry point to consider, and a 4-step plan to follow if you are going to do this yourself. So I do welcome any questions if anyone does have it, or if they weren't clear on anything I said, I can explain it. I can see Simon and Stuart, but Simon's already unmuted, so I'll go to Simon first and then Stuart.
I was just wondering if there's any, I know it's horses for courses, but are there any industry, the figures you were quoting there about how many people listen all the way through and all that kind of thing? Any stats on percentage of response from podcasts? I don't mean return on investment, because obviously that depends on the offer, but click-through rates and that kind of thing.
Well, I actually mentioned it in the presentation. 75% of people that listen to podcasts do follow up with a call to action from an ad within that podcast. So if you think 80% of that market, even 35% that listen it all the way through, 75% of them are highly likely to follow through. There was a case study with a juice brand that reduced their spend on podcasting, but narrowed down to their audience, and overall increased globally the value of their brand and sales by 2 billion. I'll try and find the case study and share it if I can by email to everyone or on my LinkedIn, but it's a very, very interesting case study in terms of how effective it can be. Now, this is a very rare case scenario, but it shows that once you really understand your audience, and it kind of shows that, what we're trying to say is that we highlighted in stats that, podcast listeners are very loyal, affluent and educated, and they are very, very engaged in terms of what they're listening to. So that message isn't competing against other messages. You're only going to get one message from one brand in a podcast. Whereas if you jump into social media, as you're scrolling down, you've already probably got 10 different ads within the space of the first couple of minutes. So it's very, very, very competitive to capture someone's attention. So you've got to be more creative. Whereas if you can be creative and you can have that one-to-one experience with someone who's listening to a podcast, that could be anything from 30 to 40 minutes on average, then you've really got their attention. So it's all on how creative you can get.
Sorry, can I just jump in based on
follow up.
You just said? Sorry, Stuart. I'm assuming then that a one-off is no good, is it? You've got some consistency on the same podcast title would be good.
It depends. So if you're working with a singular podcast or podcastee, as I say, so if you're working with a particular podcaster, let's say if it was us, then you would have to try multiple things to see it. But the results from the first campaign will let you know what's doing. But this is where it's important to understand your audience. So do try multiple elements. I said try both. Try dynamic inserted, going directly through Spotify's ad platform and maybe going through there, or going directly through Apple search ads and actually going directly through their platform. Or you could come to us and we could help you do it, however you want to do it. Or if you are going to create those relationships, that means you will have to go and identify which podcast you feel your brand's going to align. And you're going to have to have those conversations like you would with influencers, with whoever's hosting or running that podcast channel. And you don't know what level of competition or who they want to work with. They could turn around and say they don't want to do that. Again, this is just all hypothetical, but it's trying to identify the best podcast. But if you do have a budget in mind and try and work out a good deal where you can get multiple episodes included so that you can follow up with those people on the next time. I think that would be a good idea to do more than one. Don't just give it one test and think it didn't work. Understand the data and then go again. And if it still doesn't deliver results, and then pick up the phone and call me. And then we'll see what we can.
Thank you very much for that, mate. I need to drop off. But
no worries. Thanks for coming on, Simon.
We're giving you a call, okay?
Yeah.
Cheers.
Stuart, you had a question.
I've actually got sort of two, and they're not unconnected to what Simon was just saying. So, in your opinion, does this essentially work better for B2B or B2C companies? And how does it compare? Because to me, the way you've described it, it almost sounds like it compares to, say, radio advertising. which is quite old school by my sort of modern digital standards. How does it compare to that? And by comparison, I'm sort of thinking price, effectiveness, all that kind of stuff. So there's a couple of open questions for you to go.
Okay, so two things to compare it to is, you're right, it is radio because it is an audio ad, but you can have a physical display or image when you're within Spotify. So think of it as a mixture between the targeting elements you can do within a display campaign or a Facebook campaign in terms of how you can break your audience down. That's dynamically inserted, but the audio of essentially your video ad, but without the video. It's just the audio element to it. So, it's like the radio elements. So it is a blend of all the different elements. So which I think is why it does quite well. And the more you make it relevant to your audience and the more quirky and creative you make it, the more they're going to remember it. So that just goes down with any platform you're on, whether you're in social, video, the more you make it creative and think out of the box to make, get brand recall, the better it is. So yeah, in that sense, in terms of that first question, yes, it is like radio, but you've got more targeting options. And that's why understanding your audience is key, because then when you go into platforms like Spotify, it's going to ask you to break down your audience by geolocation, by age, by gender. And the more you know, the better opportunity you have to place that more dynamically. And sorry, I can't remember what your second part of that question.
B2B or B2C?
So B2B, B2C, I can't really give any stats at this stage, but I know there's multiple of people looking into it. We actually have a strategy in place to actually trial it from a B2B perspective to see if we can target, industry leaders, business owners that are, tapping into, podcasts like, Kate Leeson, etc., who talk from a director level. Etc. So, if they're listening to that for marketing advice, maybe we can jump on the bandwagon, but it's hard to do it. So I say it approaches both who you're trying to target, because you've got everyday listeners that will be your general consumers that listen to podcasts. But then just remember, your B2B audience is going to be a lot more niche. Because you're trying to hit the decision maker. It's a bit like LinkedIn. You're trying to hit the decision maker. You have to break it down and try and understand it. So you're probably going to get better results from a B2C business point of view, but that doesn't mean it's still not relevant from a B2B element if you get your audience right and, great, build great direct relationships with them. Nick, go ahead.
Stuart mentioned radio advertising, which is obviously it's monitored. The listeners is monitored by an independent organisation, as is TV viewing figures, as is newspaper readership, and so on. Who monitors independently how many people are listening to individual podcasts?
So
if it's cost per milli, it's got to be justified somewhere.
Yeah, so that's why there's different ad formats. You've got pre-roll, so you can get them right at the start, mid-roll, and then you've got outro. So if you place your ad at the end, again, you only get charged per 1,000 it's delivered. So if no one gets to the end of that podcast, you're not going to get charged because your ad's not going to play. And you'll know because the stats come from the platforms in terms of how many full plays you've had of your audio ad.
So it's from the platforms.
Yeah. So the platforms, it's similar like with YouTube example. When you're running a YouTube campaign and you go into the Google Ads account and you look at the statistics, it tells you, how many video plays you've had and how many have gone through X amount, which is slightly different, but you then get to see how it is. If you've got a long video, then it'll tell you how many people skipped after 5 seconds, but they'll show you how many people actually got to 5 seconds. And again, they're the in-stream YouTube ads. And that's why I made that comparison. So you know how it relates. And it's a good example to use because, if at the start you're going to hit everyone, so it's going to be more effective, but then that cost per million might be higher to achieve that placement. Your probably best conversion rate is going to come with right at the end and supporting that with a middle placement. So, in podcast ad to reinforce it and then finish it off with an outro ad. Because that's going to then recall that 75% that then take that call to action and you consider 35% get to the end. It can be very, very lucrative from a conversion point of view. But the data is tracked by, the data from Spotify. We use Podchaser, which is why I mentioned it, where you can then, look at multiple platforms at one go in terms of the data, where people are listening to the amount of podcasts. But the data in terms of listens and how it comes from Apple, Spotify, Google, etc. Any other questions? Nick Clark.
I can kind of see how podcast advertising could work with for product. If you've got a product that you're selling, how would it work for? Could it work for services or for professional services? I mean, obviously, it's a bit. It sounds like it's a bit unproven in the B2B marketplace anyway at the moment.
Oh, if it was my advice to you is there's a lot of podcasts out there, and don't just think of volume of listeners. You've got podcasts out there that get 1,000-2,000 listeners, but they're run by businesses such as ourselves. So you want to be kind of targeting them kind of podcasts where it's a business that could implement. So maybe it's a law firm that's doing a podcast and is giving advice. They're going to have clients, they're going to have businesses and decision makers on that podcast trying to listen in. So I guarantee you there'll be people doing podcasts about the budget right now. And there's going to be business decision makers listening to that budget-based podcast based on who they're going to go to. And it could be their local accountancy firm that's done that podcast and set it up that gets 3,000-4,000, listens in a month. That's if you're a service-based business, that's where you should be targeting. And that's who you should be going to. So if it's Joanna who works with Pure Clarity and they want to target marketing agencies, I would be going to those people that are going out and giving marketing advice and actually talking to other marketing agencies that are doing their own podcasts and giving their insights. Because when we look at the list, we get a lot of people from a marketing background that come and attend that bite size. But we also know that, we get a lot of marketing people listening to our podcast as well, because we're sharing advice about marketing. So from a service perspective, from a SaaS platform, they would want to start building relationships with agency-based podcasts and featuring on that. That would be the strategy I would implement, but we'd go into a lot more detail about how to do that. So that's just an example of how service-based businesses can do it. It's not about just going for the Katie Leesons, the Joe Rogans, and the Kim K's of the world in terms of podcasts. It's great for us to feature all that, but leave that to the brew dogs of the world. Focus on, where, that's why audience fit is key. It's probably the most important step, understanding your audience, because once you know who your audience is and how they behave, it gives you a better idea of what, how you should align your content accordingly.